All right. Good evening, everybody. All right, we're a little past time to start. We're in Genesis 42 tonight, and I tell you, before we jump into Genesis 42, let's do a little bit of wrapping up at the end of Genesis 41. So Genesis 41 ends by Joseph being promoted in the land of Egypt. And Joseph's promotion is, it's a mark physically, like materially, in a worldly sense. It's a mark of his ascent. Right, from a worldly perspective, Joseph is on top of the world at the end of Genesis 41. He has more power than just about anybody else in the world. In fact, you could count him the second most powerful person on earth at the end of Genesis 41. Pharaoh, of course, being the most powerful, because Egypt is far and away the most powerful empire on the face of the earth during this time, and they are for a long, long time. And Pharaoh is at the top of that food chain, as it were. Joseph is in the number 2 position. He has lots and lots of authority, and in fact, the authority that he has is going to be very, very important, because what do we know is coming? Well, the family's coming, but I mean, what event do we know is coming? The famine. And what does Joseph happen to be in charge of? The food. Yeah. So his position is going to be extraordinarily important. And you look at the things that happened to him. He's given Pharaoh's signet ring, he's given fine linen, he's given a gold chain, he's given the Pharaoh's second chariot. They call out before him, "Bow the knee." This is in verse 43. And Pharaoh sets him over all the land of Egypt. All right, and then look at this. "Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." So he's given extraordinary authority. And then he is married into an important family. All right, so verse 45, Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah. So he's given an Egyptian name. He gave him in marriage Asenat, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So he marries into a priestly family. In the priestly caste, in pretty much any ancient nation, the priestly caste is among the most important people. Wayne?
Where in the hierarchy of gods and goddesses is On? Is he not on the top?
I don't think that he's the very top, no. I'm not sure where he is. Now, Pharaoh, I can tell you, Pharaoh is given a very, very important position because Egyptians considered him to be the incarnation of Horus. Very, very important Egyptian god, considered to be the son of Re. So he is, and by the way, in that we should see, we should read this Christologically, right? And this is the way that Christians have always seen the claims of Jesus. Jesus claims to be the Son of God, to be God incarnate, and to be king over everything. That is a direct assault against all other forms of authority. Right? Jesus' authority it's not just its own separate authority, in the midst of a bunch of other authorities. Jesus is claiming ultimate authority over and against all other authorities. And even in his time, the rulers were considered to be divine. Right? In fact, we've got in modern times, we're relatively the odd ones out in not considering rulers to be divine. Even then, in a lot of monarchies, the monarch is considered to have divine right, divinely installed. Pharaoh is the is considered to be the incarnation of Horus, which tells us something about what it means for Pharaoh to give him his signet ring, to give him his second chariot, to give him all of these identity markers for us to identify him with Pharaoh. Because that's the thing, Joseph, again, he looks like, from a worldly perspective, he is on top. But spiritually, he is at pretty much rock bottom. This is a spiritual descent for Joseph. We finished on Sunday talking about the markers of this transformation that he goes through, and how this should be, if we're of a mind to think that Joseph, throughout his entire story, is very righteous and saintly, this should completely shatter that. He is given the markers of Pharaoh, like we talked about, the signet ring, the cord, the chain, the fine linen, the chariot. And remember, we tied this to Judah and Tamar. Whenever Tamar asks for that down payment from Judah so that he could go into her, what does she ask for? Well, for his ring, his cord that he wears about his neck, and his staff, because those are his identifying marks. Joseph is given the identifying marks of Pharaoh, including his chariot, which Joseph uses to ride all around the land of Egypt. Everybody has to bow to Joseph, and we should understand that to mean fully what it is. Whenever you're bowing before Pharaoh, you're not if you're an Egyptian bowing before Pharaoh, you're not just bowing before a king as an earthly authority figure. It's bowing both in the civil sense, recognizing his civil authority, but it's also bowing in the religious sense. And Joseph is, does Joseph object to any of this? Does Joseph resist any of this? We don't really get much of a reaction from Joseph at all. He gets a new name, Zaphanat Paneah. Now, this name is not used again of him that I can remember, at least not through, say, 43 or 44. I would need to look ahead a little more. The text continues to refer to him as Joseph. But we can't miss the importance of this, that he is given an Egyptian name. And we've been noting as we go through the parallels with Daniel. You remember in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel and his 3 friends were given new names. And it's weird. For some reason, we never call Daniel by his Babylon name, but we only call the friends by their Babylonian names. But they're all given Babylonian names. Daniel is called Belteshazzar. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah we better know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, they're given new names. How do Daniel and his friends react? They don't oppose the new names in Daniel chapter 1, but they're also given a Babylonian education. They're given a special diet from the king. And do Daniel and his friends just go along with all of it?
No, that's for a special diet.
They resist the diet. All right, now they don't resist the whole package deal, but they do resist the diet. And in fact, throughout the book of Daniel, you see Daniel and his 3 friends resisting the Babylonian regime. You see it with the diet in chapter 1. You see it in chapter 3 with the idol. The 3 friends refuse to bow and worship the idol. You see it in chapter 6 whenever Darius tries to compel everybody to pray through him. And Daniel refuses, and he continues to pray in his upper chamber 3 times a day. And so throughout the story, Daniel and his 3 friends are resisting these influences from the Babylonians. Again, we don't have any of that with Daniel. Daniel doesn't push back against this at all. He seems rather to accept the new Egyptian identity he is given. Sorry? Did I say Daniel? Yeah, Joseph. Thank you. Joseph seems to accept the identity that he's given. We noted on Sunday that he marries into the Egyptian priesthood, and that usually membership of a priestly caste is it's pretty exclusive, meaning that if he is given in marriage to the daughter of a priest, that's our signal that he is being inducted into the Egyptian priesthood. And we see evidence of him engaging in their priestly practices. I gave an example on Sunday in chapter 44. Remember at the beginning of the chapter, Joseph has the steward of his house put his silver cup into Benjamin's sack. And then he has the steward chase them down and look in the sack. And in verse 5, he's found the cup. Is it not from this that my Lord drinks, and by this that he practices divination? You have done evil in doing this, the steward says. But the steward lets us in on this information that Joseph has been practicing divination. In other words, he's engaged in the practices of the Egyptian priesthood. And then finally, and we didn't get to finish talking about the naming of the children towards the end of the chapter. Chapter 41, verse 50. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenat, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Now we finished by talking about this, the significance of him saying that he has been caused to forget all of his father's house. Remember, my father's house, or the house of Israel, talking about a house, you're not just talking about, the structure, you're not just talking about your immediate family, you're talking about your entire heritage. Who is the house of Israel? Well, it's the whole nation. It's the whole kit and caboodle. And it goes all the way back to Abraham. It doesn't just stop at Israel. Right? What Joseph is doing here is he says that God, our English translations say, capital G, God has caused him to forget the house of Israel. Now, we also talked about the significance of forgetting, right? It's not that it's no longer in his memory, it's that he is separated from it, that he is abandoning it, repudiating it, as it were. Is that the God of Israel doing that? Look, all of the promises of God come through the house of Israel. Come through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Even we as Christians need to understand that Jesus comes as a result of these promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not separate and apart from it. They are a fulfillment of those promises. We rely on the benefits of our Father's house. And Paul goes so far as to say that Abraham is the father of all the faithful. Right? Even though we may not be ethnically Jewish, we still claim Abraham as our father in the most important sense. And Joseph says, forget him. Forget all of them. What Joseph is invoking here is, again, not the God of Israel, because, again, he's telling us that he's repudiating the house of Israel. He's not calling on Israel's God. He's calling on the Egyptian gods. The gods have made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. And if we understand that Joseph has repudiated Israel and repudiated all of the promises of God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he has repudiated the God of Israel, then the next verse is especially perverse. The name of the second son he called Ephraim, for God, or the gods have made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. All right, and this, again, if we think that Joseph is a faithful Hebrew, if we read this as capital G God, this just looks like a normal, faithful name. Because what has God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? But to make them fruitful, to give them descendants like the sand of the sea. And instead, Joseph again, repudiating everything from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is now saying the gods have made him fruitful in the land of his affliction. And for him, what's without count, like the sand of the sea, it's all the grain he's storing up. It's his material wealth that he's accumulating for Egypt and that he is going to be lord over. All right, so this is practically rock bottom for Joseph. And then the last thing we read in the chapter is that the 7 years of plenty come to an end, and the famine comes. And when all the land of Egypt, verse 55, was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And where does Pharaoh direct them? Go to Joseph. He's your guy. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. All right, so again, from a worldly perspective, Joseph seems, honestly, even to be the most powerful man on earth. Because you go to Pharaoh, and where does Pharaoh direct you? To Joseph. George?
If we can, back in 51 and 52, what is it that you've studied that says this is not a capital G God, lowercase God?
Right. All right. So as we've been talking about throughout the class, the word Elohim can mean capital G God, or it can mean lowercase g gods, because in Hebrew it's a plural word. But the Hebrews refer to Adonai, to the God of Israel, as Elohim, using the plural. So in this particular case, in verse 51, what causes me to say that this is probably Joseph invoking the lowercase g gods is this repudiation of his father's house. That he has forgotten all his hardship and all his father's house. This is not the sort of phrase that you find in Hebrew to talk about, and again, it doesn't matter like what translation you're using, right? You can see this in translation too. You're not going to find anybody else in the Old Testament saying, I have forgotten my father's house, to mean, oh, God has just soothed me from being separated from my family. Whenever the father's house is invoked, it's talking about somebody's whole background, somebody's heritage. In fact, we're going to see in chapter 43 where Joseph's steward tells the brothers, because remember, they end up finding the money in their saddlebags, and they take it back, and the steward, let me find it here, chapter 43, verse 23. Yeah, peace to you, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has put your treasure in the sacks for you. In other words, not just your God, the God of your whole people. Whenever we're talking about the father and the father's house, we're talking about the entire background, the entire heritage. And Joseph is repudiating it in verse 51. So, and again, if there's all of these other things as well, piling on top of that, to show us Joseph he's not faithful. He's not faithful at this point. You can't get around him being a second Pharaoh and having people bow to him. You can't get around him practicing divination. He's engaged in pagan practices.
But he was very young when he was sold to the Egyptians, right?
He was 17.
Oh.
Yeah, we're told that at the beginning of Genesis 37. So, at this point, using lowercase g gods begins with the understanding that based off all of this stuff, there's no way that Joseph is faithful. And if he's not faithful, I suppose he could be trying to invoke the God of Israel. Again, that would seem to conflict with this, that he has forgotten his father's house. But if he is, he's doing it as a blasphemer. Because, again, he's not faithful to the God of Israel, if that makes sense. Yeah, David?
What would indicate that he is being faithful? I'm sure there was lots of the people from Israel that traveled to Egypt
Well,
to get fed.
That's going to be...
I remember his homeland was feeding his people.
Well, that's going to be the subject of our study in chapter 42, that there are going to be people going down from Egypt, and we'll see what Joseph does to them. Again, one of the other things that we've noticed about all of the patriarchs is that they begin their lives relatively rotten and relatively faithless, and over the course of their life, God acts in their lives to essentially to convert them. All of the patriarchs are converted, including Abraham. We see Abraham really early on in Genesis 12 being completely faithless. So, and I don't know if that got to your question, George, all of that material about Joseph's faithlessness. Again, if we want to interpret it as a capital G God, Joseph is blaspheming. Okay, so that wraps us up on Genesis 41 and gets us to Genesis 42. Any further questions or comments before we jump into it? Okay, let's pray together. Righteous Father, thank you for the great gifts that you've given us today. Thank you for our time together to study from your word. And Father, I pray that you bless us as we read through this text. Help us, Father, to see the history of your people, to recognize, Father, that it is our history and that we should identify ourselves with these people, recognize them as our forefathers in the faith. Father, thank you for the great gifts that you've given us in your Son. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, let's start. We'll start in verse 1. And we'll go through, I tell you what, we've got a little less than 20 minutes. We'll just read and see how far we get. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said to him, "No, my lord. Your servants have come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. We're honest men. Your servants have never been spies." He said to them, "No, it is the nakedness of the land you've come to see." And they said, we, your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more. But Joseph said to them, "It is as I said, you are spies. By this you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. Or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." And he put them all together in custody for 3 days. All right, let's stop our reading there for now, so we don't get too far ahead of ourselves here. All right, so at the end of chapter 41, we learned that the famine was severe, not just in Egypt, but everywhere. People the whole world over are coming down to Joseph to buy grain. There's food in Egypt, but nowhere else. And so Jacob hears that there is food available down in Egypt, and he upbraids his sons for their inaction. Why do you look at one another? At the end of verse 1. This is the equivalent of, why are you standing around making faces? Why are you staring at your belly button? Right? Get up and do something. He said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." Those are the stakes. You either go down and buy food, or we are all dead. So he sends 10 of them, but he doesn't send Benjamin for fear that he will come to harm. All right, well, what about the rest of his brothers? What about the other 10 sons? Isn't there a chance that they'll come to harm? What is it that makes Benjamin so special? Well, what is it? Okay, he's Rachel's son, and he's the only surviving son of Rachel, as far as Jacob knows. He's also the baby of the family, although by this point he's almost certainly no actual baby. He's the youngest, and the most important thing is, I think he is the only remaining son of Rachel. And in fact, we'll see Jacob put it in those terms later in the book. That, look, you're trying to get Benjamin killed, and Joseph's already dead too. Well, if that's a concern, then why did he send the other 10 down? He doesn't have the same concern about the other 10. I mean, he's not quite saying that, but he is kind of acting that way. Yeah. All right, so the sons of Israel came to buy grain, we read in verse 5. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. It's been a while since we've seen Jacob's national name. Wayne, did you have a question?
It's funny to me. I guess it's just, because, we talk so much about this in church.
Uh-huh.
That, we're directed by God to give it to the needy.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, here's some needy people, and what's he doing? He's selling.
Joseph, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, they sell. So that tells you something about
Yeah, he's engaged. So we shouldn't think of Joseph's project like, food stamps or something, where the Egyptian government is just handing out grain for free. Yeah, Moses has told us twice up to this point that Joseph is selling the grain, even to the people of Israel. Not Israel, Egypt. Let's see. Yeah, in chapter 41, verse 56, Joseph opens all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. So part of what Joseph is doing is he's also consolidating Pharaoh's power over Egypt. This isn't a charity case for Joseph. The throne is making lots of money off of this. In fact, and we know that empires can become extraordinarily rich off of stuff like this. If you ever studied like ancient Ghana in Africa, they made a killing off of salt. They had lots of salt mines. There's a lot of desert around them, and so they sold salt practically by weight for gold, and they made tons and tons of gold off of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's always something that the rulers can make a lot of money off of, and in this case, Joseph is doing that with grain. All right, but back to chapter 42 and verse 5. The sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. All right, so this is getting to, David, what you were asking about. Aren't the Israelites going to go down as well, and how's Joseph going to treat them? Well, this is it, the sons of Israel coming down. It has been a while since we've seen Jacob's national name. I don't know if you've noticed this in the text, that way back in chapter 32 that he's given the name Israel. at the end of 32, we've not seen that name a whole lot. Most of the time it's still Jacob. And part of what happens is it usually gets invoked whenever we're supposed to think of the national identity. Right? Whenever we're supposed to think of Jacob in terms of his place as the seed of the nation, right? The source of the nation's name. And so whenever we read that the sons of Israel go down to Egypt, that should be evocative to us, right? Like the way it's used here is a stock name for the people of the nation. The sons of Israel, or the children of Israel, means the people of the nation of Israel. And what this does is this foreshadows the Egyptian slavery. Right, because we know ultimately the whole nation of Israel is going to be in Egypt in slavery. And this also directs us back to the last time that we saw famine among the patriarchs. We've already seen 2 other famines in Genesis up to this point. Do y'all remember the other 2 famines? Abraham went through one, and Isaac went through one. Do you know what they both did? Only one of them went to Egypt, but they both went to pagan kings, and they both lied about their wives. Right? Both of those instances happen in the midst of famine. And this is supposed to bring that to our mind. What happened the last time the family tree experienced a famine and went down to Egypt? Was it good? No. Now, of course, it foreshadows way ahead, because how did Abraham come out of Egypt in Genesis 12? Y'all remember?
Yeah, he was given lots of animals.
Yeah, he was made rich in Egypt. How's Israel going to come out of Egypt way after this? They're going to come out rich. Remember, they plunder Egypt in the Exodus. They're going to come out rich. But here, it's supposed to give us a sense of foreboding. All right, so as we're reading through chapter 42, I want you to pretend for a minute that you don't know how this story is going to end. Try to pretend like you've never read this story before. What you know is there's a famine. Everybody is starving. Jacob's hit the point where he says, look, go down there, get us some grain so we don't die. He sends the 10 brothers. And we have, again, all of this dark foreshadowing. Excuse me. We think of when Abraham went down to Egypt during the famine and how badly that turned out. Excuse me. And we read this in verse 6. Joseph was governor over the land. All right, so the perspective of the narrative is shifting to Joseph. We're getting this from his perspective. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. All right, so how is Joseph treating his brothers up to this point?
Better than they treated him.
All right, we could say that, better than they treated him. We're gonna get at that too, because we're gonna see a bit of turnabout is fair play in this chapter. But he treats them, the ESV says like strangers. The King James, I think, the ESV muddles it whenever it translates it that way. The King James renders it more clearly. He acted like he was a foreigner to them. In other words, he treats them, he acts like he's an Egyptian and they are Hebrews, what they perceive. He lets it stand that way. He treats them like foreigners, and he speaks roughly to them. In fact, this word roughly here is only used a couple of times. It's used here. It's used in just a little bit whenever the brothers describe to Jacob the way that they were treated. But then the next time that we see it after that is in Exodus chapter 1, where we're told how the Egyptians treated the Israelites. Right? Because Israel started multiplying in the land and the Egyptians became fearful, so they treated them harshly or roughly and enslaved them and caused them to do all of this work. Here, Joseph is treating his brothers like foreigners and speaking roughly to them. In fact, we're told here twice that Joseph recognizes his brothers, but he doesn't reveal himself to them. They don't recognize him. And whenever the text tells us that he acts like they're foreigners to him, here the story is tapping into another sojourning narrative that we've read before. Because who else have we seen famously who treats their own kin like foreigners in Genesis? Starts with an L, yeah. Laban. Remember, whenever Jacob goes to Rachel and Leah and says, hey, we're going to highball it out of here, Rachel and Leah don't object. They say, yeah, let's get out of here. Our father has treated us like foreigners. All right, their own father treated them like foreigners. And here, Joseph is treating his brothers like foreigners. And again, we're supposed to have that in our mind as we're reading through. The signs are adding up. This looks like a really bad situation. Abraham in Egypt, Jacob in Paddan Aram. Those were terrible, terrible times. Laban oppressed and tried to swindle his son-in-law and his daughters. And here Joseph is treating his brothers like foreigners. Now, of course, in the midst of this, well, we get this in verse 9. Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. And of course, there's a reason for that, because we read a fulfillment of those dreams in, let's see, verse 6. At the end of verse 6, Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground, paying homage to Joseph. Which is, again, precisely what he said he dreamt at the beginning of Genesis 37. Hey, there were these sheaves, and your sheaves bowed down to my sheaf. And of course, they know what that means. Here, we're not told that they're thinking about that at all. They have no idea who this is in front of them. But Joseph remembers. Now, this does a really neat thing. Here, the text gets us inside of Joseph's head without really telling us what he thinks. Right? We know that he remembers the vision. What's he remember about it? Does the text tell us? What's he think about it? Does the text tell us? Do we assume that it makes him think of the faithfulness of God? Oh yeah, these visions have come true, just like God said. Where did God say those were going to come true? It doesn't say it in the text. We read that into the text. Do we assume that he's self-satisfied? The text doesn't say. We are given absolutely nothing about what Joseph is thinking, other than that he remembers the dream that he dreamt about his brothers. Moses doesn't tell us what he thinks. We're only given how he acts. And so far, what do his actions look like? He's treating them like foreigners, he's treating them roughly, and then what's the very next thing that he says to them after he remembers the dreams? You are spies. You've come to see the nakedness of the land, Joseph says. All right, and we've talked about this before. It's been a while since we've talked about this phrase, to see one's nakedness or to uncover one's nakedness. It was way back in like Genesis 11, I think, whenever Ham uncovered Noah's nakedness. In the Old Testament, uncovering someone's nakedness always refers to what kind of action? We'll just say taking advantage of somebody. We say that euphemistically. To uncover someone's nakedness, particularly in the sexual laws in Leviticus, talks about having one's way with somebody. The imagery is supposed to be evocative. He's making a sharp, serious accusation against them. Y'all have come to rape the land. And, okay, what are they supposed to think about that? What are we supposed to think about it? Again, we've not really been put inside of Joseph's head. Why is he doing all of this? Moses has been cueing us in, this is going to be a bad situation, guys. And now all of a sudden it's turned into what looks like a really bad situation. He accuses them of spying, and their answer is to grovel before Joseph. Verse 10, they said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. We're honest men. Your servants have never been spies." And Joseph just repeats himself. No, it's the nakedness of the land that you've come to see. And at this point, they freak out. They spill their guts to Joseph. Look at what they do. Pay attention in verses 12 and following. What does anything that they say have to do with this accusation? They're panicking. They are spilling their guts. Verse 13, they said, we your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more. In other words, they're trying to be transparent with Joseph. They're telling him things. They're oversharing. Right? What does Joseph care? What business is it of Joseph's? Or from their perspective, Zapanath Paneah's. What business is it of his that they are 12 brothers, sons of one man from the land of Canaan, and that their little brother is with their father, and one of the brothers is no more? All right, and this is where we'll end tonight. So we're given, all right, there's going to be a lot of dramatic irony in this chapter. That is, where we are in on something that some of the characters are not in on. We know, and Joseph knows, and we know that Joseph knows, what they mean by one of our brothers is no more. Yeah, exactly, that's him. Now they're making it sound like what? Like he's dead.
Said he's no longer alive.
Yeah, he is no more. We've heard them say that about Joseph before, to Jacob. They tell Joseph the same lie that they told to Jacob. And Joseph knows it. All right, now we're gonna sit on that and see where Joseph goes from there. But we know that they're panicking. We know that Joseph is being rough with them, and we know they've just lied to Joseph, and that Joseph knows that they have lied. Any final questions or comments?
But at this point, do the brothers know that? Yeah, because they sold him in a slave, so they do know that he.
They sold him as a slave, and from there they don't know where he went. They don't know what's happened to him. They don't know anything about him, and the last time they saw him, he was alive. But that's going to be the basis of a lot of the irony that's going to come for the rest of the chapter. They don't know what's happened to Joseph, but we do. All right, thank you so much for your kind attention, your questions, and your comments this evening.